Welcome to the Minnesota Zen Meditation Center. My name is Randy Wedin. I'm a lay teacher here. And I see a few familiar faces in here. And I see a familiar face out there in Zoom land too. Tonight's talk is about compassion, and which is one of the two foundations of Buddhism, they say sometimes, along with wisdom. And it's often said that compassion and wisdom are the two wings that allow us to fly towards enlightenment. So compassion is kind of foundational. But I realized last fall that I was kind of confused about the meaning of compassion. And I realized that Zen talks a lot about compassion, but it doesn't really specifically define compassion, and it doesn't teach us how to develop compassion. So I've been kind of on a hunt for clarity this past year about what is compassion. So, and the title of my talk is some questions that came up. So the title of my talk is 3 questions related to compassion. And so this evening, I'm going to tell you about what I've learned in those past few months since last fall on this hunt. And in particular, this involves a week-long conference about compassion that I attended the first week of June. So this is a little bit like those school reports. What did you do last summer? So sometime in the fall of 2023, I was reading about neuroscience and meditation, which just happens to be one of my favorite subjects. And I came across a couple scientific articles from neuroscientists who study compassion and meditation. And these articles pointed out that there is kind of a difference, a sort of a nuanced difference between compassion and empathy. And I hadn't really thought about it, any sort of difference between compassion and empathy. So in this study, they were studying neural patterns of meditators. And when meditators were engaged in something which was called compassion meditation, the regions of the brain that are associated with reward and positive feelings were activated. So that's with compassion meditation. But if these same people were just empathizing with people who are suffering, like in pictures or something like this, the regions of the brains that were activated were regions associated with feeling pain, feeling your own pain or pain of others. So there's a difference in the brain when you're between compassion and empathy. And this really kind of surprised me and startled me. So that's what got me realizing that I'm confused about compassion. So that's when I formulated these 3 questions that we're going to talk about tonight. The questions are, what exactly is compassion? And can it be developed? How can it be developed? Second question. Third question is, how can I use compassion in the world? So when I first was dealing with these questions last fall, I had no idea at that point that I was going to be spending a full week at an international conference on compassion. So let me tell you about how that happened. How did I happen to be at a meeting in June sponsored by a nonprofit organization called the Mind and Life Institute? So the Mind and Life Institute is an organization that has a number of programs, but the one that they're most well known for, and the one that we were originally created for, was to sponsor and arrange for these things called the Mind and Life Dialogues. And the Mind and Life Dialogues, these dialogues are a series of meetings that have been held since 1987, and the dialogues were between the Dalai Lama and Western scientists, and they've been happening about every 2 years. And they arose because the Dalai Lama was very interested in Western science, and so they started arranging these pretty small, intimate meetings, although some of them were quite large, but to discuss the sort of the interaction of science and spirituality. And so here's an example. This is a book written by the Dalai Lama that describes some of the things that came out of some of these dialogues. This book is called The Universe in a Single Atom, The Convergence of Science and Spirituality. And in the prologue of this book, I'll just read a couple sentences from this book. The great benefit of science is that it can contribute tremendously to the alleviation of suffering at the physical level. But it is only through the cultivation of the human heart and the transformation of our attitudes that we can begin to address and overcome our mental suffering. Through a dialogue between these two disciplines, I hope that both science and spirituality may develop to be of better service to the needs and well-being of humanity. And the primary subjects that have been talked about in these dialogues over the years have been subatomic physics, cosmology, neuroscience, and psychology. So there's chapters in here that deal with some of those topics. And this is actually a book that I used and read for a Zen and science class that I taught last year here at the Zen Center, and I assigned some readings out of this book. So that's when I first sort of became fully aware of this Mind and Life Institute and these Mind and Life dialogues. So I started checking out more about what this organization was all about, this Mind and Life Institute. And I learned that from its website that it does more than just hold these dialogues. It has a digital library of the content of these dialogues over the years. It has over 70 podcasts. It has a bunch of essays. It has a blog, and it has a monthly newsletter. And it also sponsors this thing called a Summer Research Institute. And the Summer Research Institute has been held annually since 2004. And it's a conference that brings together researchers, contemplatives, and change makers, this is the words they use, from around the world each summer. And their goal is to catalyze the fields of contemplative research and contemplative action. And many of the people attending this conference are in this rapidly growing field, which is known as contemplative science. So you may not have heard about this field called contemplative science, but it's an interdisciplinary field. It's been around since the 1990s, and it's pretty much rapidly growing since then. But it's a field that uses contemplative practices like mindfulness and meditation in the study of the mind and the brain and the body. And it's unusual as a science because it combines first-person subjective experience, like when you're meditating, that's first person, what are you thinking, but it combines that with third person objective scientific measures, like you get from neuroscience and psychology. So that's what makes it pretty unusual as a science. And as like I said, it's been growing rapidly. So I was studying this learning as I just learned about this Summer Research Institute that they hold every summer, and I thought, wow, that would really be cool to attend one of those. So I applied, and lo and behold, I got accepted. And so that's how I found myself at a retreat center along the Hudson River, about 50 miles north of New York City, with 140 folks from 22 countries in the first week of June. And the topic of this conference institute was awakening compassion in times of division. And the reason it was compassion was because compassion has become a really hot topic in contemplative science. In the 1990s and the 2000s, a lot of people were studying mindfulness meditation and what is, how can you study that from a scientific standpoint? And more recently, they've been studying more about loving kindness meditation and compassion meditation. So compassion is a hot topic in the academic world right now. And so here I was, I had these questions about compassion, and all of a sudden I'm going to a conference about compassion, and maybe I'll get some answers. So I thought I'd tell you about what I learned. And so let me remind you, I had 3 questions. What is compassion? How can it be developed? And how can I bring my compassion into the world? And I'll just give you a hint that my expectations were kind of exceeded. I was kind of blown away at this conference. So I want to tell you what I learned and some of the people I met. So the format was pretty diverse. There were plenary lectures, there were panels, there were breakout set groups, poster presentations, networking opportunities, and one of the interesting things is there was daily contemplative time. There were that included meditation and yoga and qigong and walking in nature, and there was 2 half-day retreats that were built right into this week-long conference. So first question I had, what is compassion? And the plenary lectures were pretty good at helping me answer that, because these were given by these, some of the academic folks, the professors, the psychologists, the anthropologists, the professors of education who gave these PowerPoint presentations. And they talked about their research studies and their theoretical frameworks and how they measured compassion and some of the programs that they put out in the field. And they each had their own little definition of compassion, which were slightly different, but they all seem to agree on three elements of compassion. So the 3 elements that I think everyone would agree go into a definition of compassion are that first component is becoming aware of another's suffering. The second component is becoming emotionally moved by another's suffering. So those first 2 really are no different than empathy. That's kind of what empathy is. You're in the other person's shoes. You're becoming aware of their suffering. You're moved by it. But the third component is how compassion is different. And the third component is that you go on and have a desire to help, and in many cases take actual action to help, to alleviate someone's suffering. So it's this action step that makes compassion different from empathy. And that's pretty important, because if a person stops at empathy, you can often, we've discovered that you can often start suffering from empathic burnout. And this has been a problem with caregivers, medical, doctors and nurses, especially during COVID, but even before that, they're around suffering a lot, and there's this empathic burnout. So medical schools, nursing schools have started to offer classes and teach about compassion, because if their students learn about this compassion and this attitude of taking action, and then they just don't get stuck in their brain with the pains, feeling the pain, but they move on to feeling the rewards and the positive feelings, and they move past the empathic burnout. So that's all, and it's these good feelings. The Dalai Lama put it pretty succinctly, because the wisdom of the tradition, spiritual traditions, really were already out there, and sometimes these scientific studies really kind of just confirm what is already out there. But the Dalai Lama says pretty succinctly, if you want others to be happy, practice compassion. If you want to be happy, practice compassion. So I felt I got a pretty good definition and understanding of what compassion is, which was my first question. My second question was, how can compassion be developed? Well, I learned that there have now been a number of compassion-based training programs that have been developed in the West. There's one from Stanford University. Stanford University has a Center for Compassion and Altruism Research and Education. Emory University in Atlanta has a Center for Contemplative Science and Compassion-Based Ethics. And there are a number of these types of centers sprinkled around the US and around the world. But these two centers have specifically developed programs for training programs for compassion. And they were developed by Tibetan monks that have come and worked at these institutions. So the Stanford program is called Contemplative Cultivation Training, or CCT, and the Emory program is called Cognitive-Based Compassion Training, or CBCT. And these training programs are being used in schools and with medical programs and other places, and they've been studied to see if they're any good, if they're effective, and the studies have shown that they are able to enhance compassion and empathy and emotional well-being. So these programs work. And I mentioned that the Tibetan monks were involved in developing these. So the programs are based on Tibetan Buddhist practices along with modern psychology, because Tibetan Buddhism has a number of mind training and practices for teaching compassion. Unlike Zen, Tibetan Buddhism is quite a bit more complex than Zen. Zen is pretty stripped down and bare, but Tibetan Buddhism has, if you're going to be a Tibetan monk, you're going to spend years and years learning lots of things, learning lots of practices, lots of philosophy. And quite some of that is specifically devoted to learning about compassion. And there's a classic Tibetan text called the Lojong, which is a series of 59 slogans and teachings that is looked to, and that was incorporated into these trainings. And one of the teachings, one of the slogans is a practice called Tonglen. Has anybody heard of Tonglen? Also known as sending and receiving. And that particular practice involves, when you're meditating, you breathe in the suffering of another person. Very, very graphically visualize breathing in the suffering. It's like a very dark, sticky substance, and you breathe it into your lungs. And then you breathe out light, comfort, and happiness to that person. That's called Tonglen. And when I got back to Minnesota after and was trying to make sense of all the things that I had learned, I realized and remembered that I had actually learned this practice here at a workshop here at the Zen Center, and had heard about this Lojong stuff before. And it was at a workshop given by an author, a Zen priest that comes through here every couple of years. His name is Norm Fisher. He's from the Bay Area, and he's a good friend of some of the priests here. He's written a number of books, and he was here giving a workshop on one of his recent books. So I went to the library and pulled out that book, and it's called Training in Compassion, Zen Teachings on the Practice of Lojong. And I remember him talking about these 59 slogans. I remember him leading us through an exercise of Tonglen. So I kind of read through the introduction here to see, well, why did he write this book? Why did this Zen guy write this book about a classic Buddhist text? And he gave a couple reasons for doing that. He said one reason is that he thought Zen simplicity and directness might bring a new perspective to the classic Tibetan text. And then his second reason, he said, I thought this was confirmed what I had kind of perceived already, and this is a quote. He said it because he thought that it addressed, quote, a serious weakness in Zen, which is its deficiency in explicit teachings on compassion. So that's all to say that there are trainings and specific ways of developing compassion. That answered my second question. So my third question was, how can I take compassion out into the world? And the answer to this question came from my fellow conference participants. And I especially got the answer during meal times. And that was probably when my favorite part of this whole conference was the meal times. Partly because it was really good vegetarian food, but mostly because I kind of decided on the very first day that I was going to try to talk to a different person each time, because there were so many interesting people, and it would force me to get out of my comfort zone and meet a lot of people. And so there were people of, a lot of different ages, a lot of different places, a lot of different professions. There were undergrads, grad students, postdocs, mid-career people, older folks like me. There were people from Europe and Asia and South America, East Coast, West Coast, Madison, Wisconsin, Collegeville, Minnesota. There were neuroscientists, philosophers, mathematicians, Tibetan monks, there were nuns, there were authors, there were artists. So a lot of fascinating people to talk with. And I realized that these people became kind of my Sangha. It's like a big new Sangha for me. And it was a window for me into this much larger world where people from many walks of life are all pursuing common goals that I recognized and felt, same goals that I feel when I'm with you guys, of making the world a better place, a more compassionate place. There's just a big Sangha out there doing this. We're not alone. So let me just tell you about a few of the people I met and what I learned from them. One person that really, really intrigued me the first time I saw him was a guy named Dharmajati. If I'm even saying that right. He was a yogi. And he was always wearing this really comfortable outfit of Indian style, pajama style clothing. It was pretty bright orange, sort of a saffron color. And I was intimidated to talk to him just because of what he would look like. And I thought, this guy is from an entirely different planet than I am. I don't know if I can talk to him, but when I finally did get up the courage to sit down and talk to him, he was very friendly, very engaging. I really enjoyed it, and it turned out that he was originally from Spain, originally a business person and an entrepreneur, but at some point he kind of had this calling, and he went to India and joined an ashram and spent 20 years learning yoga, and got an initiation from a Swami, and then he took his business entrepreneurial skills to form a nonprofit foundation, and this foundation teaches yoga primarily to children, teenagers, and adults in refugee camps in Africa. And in fact, he was, after the conference that he was at in New York, he was going to be going back to East Africa to do some more teaching. And he said that he believes that the techniques of yoga, and here he means physical, spiritual, mental, like the whole shebang, yoga really, when you really study it, includes a lot of different things. He believes they can bring healing and transformation to vulnerable and marginalized communities. What's more marginalized and vulnerable than a refugee camp? And so his foundation has trained 87 yoga instructors in 6 African nations. And in turn, they've reached over 39,000 people, including 33,000 children and teens, and 6,000 adults. And I have a picture. I'm going to pass around a picture of him. You can see his orange outfit, where he's teaching some kids in Africa. And this is from an article on the Mind and Life website. If you want to read the full article, you can go to their website and go to the search bar and just type in yoga in Africa, and you'll see the article about him. So I learned a lesson from him, that one person who practices compassion with a clear sense of purpose and vision can make a huge difference in the world. But he wasn't the only unique person that's making a difference in the world. I shared a meal with Larry and Peggy Ward, who are Zen practitioners. And they were there to lead the 2 half-day retreats that I mentioned that were built into the conference itself. And they are senior teachers in the Thich Nhat Hanh Plum Village lineage. And they had founded an organization called the Lotus Institute, and they've traveled around the US and around the world giving teachings. So they're very well known. And I sought them out to share a meal with them because they were the only 2 people that I knew. I recognized their name and recognized what they looked like because they had actually come here and given a workshop a few years ago that I had attended. And it turned out that they, when they saw that someone was there from the Minnesota Zen Meditation Center, they were kind of looking out for me too, to meet me. And that felt pretty cool, because once again, it sort of meant, hey, we're part of a bigger sangha. I mean, they know who the Minnesota Zen Meditation Center is. We're part of this big whole group. There's on the Mind and Life website, there's a link to a video of a guided compassion meditation session that they gave during one of these retreat sessions that we had. So if you go to the website and go to the search bar and type in Larry and Peggy Ward, it'll take you to that meditation. That's like a 20-minute meditation session, a guided meditation session. So you kind of get a flavor of what they did. And then another interesting conversation I had, I think this was maybe on my first or second day, I sat down with this guy, and he turned out to be a computational mathematician who was a postdoc from Princeton. And I kind of thought, what are you doing here? You know, what's a computational mathematician doing here? And he told me that his research, which for new computational methods, which could be used in artificial intelligence, were based in part on ideas from a famous 7th century Buddhist philosopher named Dharmakirti. So he kind of explained this to me. I couldn't understand all of it. And later when he gave a poster presentation, I really couldn't understand any of it. But I saw his article, I read his article, and he did indeed reference Dharmakirti in the footnotes. But we had a good conversation about AI and Buddhism, because I've had some thoughts about that. And so we were talking about this for a while, and after a while I told him I was from Minnesota. And he said, oh, you know, I'm reading a book about a Buddhist philosopher named Vasubandhu, and it's written by someone from Minnesota. And I said, oh, that's probably Ben Connolly. He's a priest at our center, and he's a really good guy. So once again, you know, I felt like this interdependent stuff, this big Sangha stuff is all happening. By the way, here's Ben's books on Vasubandhu. They're out out there, but Ben goes around the country giving talks about Vasubandhu, who was, I think he's, I don't know if he's 2nd century or 7th century, but apparently, so Vasubandhu some of his ideas may appear in computational mathematics one of these days. So I met lots of folks, and they're bringing compassion-based ideas into working in prisons and into schools. One of the people who goes into the halls of Congress and teaches meditation to members of Congress and congressional staff. And others are working with veterans with PTSD. There was a woman who's a surgery intern at Madison, and she is working with helping surgeons learn more about mindfulness so that they can be more mindful in the operating rooms. So as I got to know more about these people, when I was sharing meals with them, I realized that compassion is not just an academic subject to be studied and learned about up here, which is kind of what I was expecting when I went there, because this is kind of an academic conference, I thought. But it became for me something to experience in my heart. I really got a really strong visceral sensation down here. And that was pretty unexpected. You know, it kind of felt a little bit like my heart was opened up. Some tears were shed. I just had not expected it. So that was kind of my answer to my third question. You know, how can I bring compassion into the world? It's pretty simple. You just, you start with whatever your passion or your profession or your interest is, you know, whatever's right in front of you. And if you see someone suffering, you let it in, you reach out and you do something. It's that simple, because these people are doing it in lots of different ways. And so then I remember back what the Dalai Lama said. He said, if you want others to be happy, practice compassion. If you want to be happy, practice compassion. So that's my report about what I've learned this summer. And now I'd like to, you know, I don't know if those little school kids get to open up the floor for questions, but now the floor is open.
Did they talk at all about sometimes when I see someone who causes suffering, I try to be compassionate towards that person, but it can be really difficult when you see,
Yeah,
see images of war or something that
Yeah.
Ukraine or Gaza. We talk about compassion when it's like not the easy type of compassion at all.
yes, I did. And they also said some of the hardest compassion besides that is self-compassion. Self-compassion is essential, but very often very difficult. So yeah, sometimes you kind of start small and don't start with everything big. Start with something specific. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I'm interested in that distinction between empathy and compassion.
Yeah.
And what I heard you say, the determining factor is taking action.
Mm-hmm.
And not just having a feeling.
Yeah.
Which is interesting, resonates with me. And I also feel like you talked about empathic burnout.
Mm-hmm.
And as a caregiver, I know that even when taking action, you can become burned out. So, and in fact, it's almost the actions that bring you out in a way, just exhausting.
Yeah.
And so trying to figure out how to maybe shine the light of compassion on that caregiving piece so that it's not so overwhelmingly difficult.
Well, I think that might go back to the self-compassion thing. Just to spend some time acknowledging your own suffering, and someone might call it taking time for yourself, but if you even more in terms of putting it in self of, I'm suffering this, can I be compassionate for myself? How can I reach out to myself to take action for myself? That might be one way of reframing it a little bit. I don't think that's going to necessarily solve everything for sure. I've seen it with my parents. My mom as a caregiver for my dad who had Alzheimer's.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, I realize there's no easy answer.
Yeah. Donnie.
Yeah, thanks for this. And it just occurred to me, I'm wondering, this kind of ties in with your last time you did a presentation. I don't know if it was the last one, but it was around the dish water detergent. I don't know if it was on loneliness.
Yeah, well, just a little backstory on that. I did a talk in earlier this year about. It was also about compassion, and it was partly because I needed to build up a little bit of something that I could use for my application for this conference, and it included a molecular metaphor for compassion. Which, since I'm a chemist and like to use metaphors, so I had this metaphor of a soap molecule and how a soap can reach out for both oil-based things and water-based things. It can reach out for two different types of things and unite them, and that's how soap works. And that's a model for compassion. And I actually used that whole thing I gave a poster presentation on that at this conference. So what were you gonna say, Donnie?
Yeah,